At the end of the day, do you see AI as a job creator or a job killer?
Well, I see it as a productivity enhancer. It will destroy employment in some areas. I mean, there will be parts of the labor market where tasks can be replaced to a degree, but then you'll also find other ways of innovating and creating more jobs somewhere else. I mean, this is the story of economic growth and innovation for hundreds of years, that you have an innovation that is basically labor saving and that reduces employment in some areas, but then boosts it in others. How that balance is going to work out in the short term, I think it's difficult to say. But where I'm much more confident is that it can significantly add to growth over time by basically boosting productivity growth. And we have actually lifted our long-term growth estimates somewhat, in part because of the impact of AI.
So AI has actually made you more bullish on the U.S. economy?
From a GDP growth perspective, yes, that's correct. I think the biggest impact probably won't be felt for another 5 years or so. So our upward revisions to growth have been sort of concentrated late this decade, early next decade. But we do view it as an economic positive from a GDP growth perspective.
Let's talk about recessions. You correctly called the recession around 2008, and you were early to the soft landing camp this time around. Are you still very confident that the U.S. economy is going to avoid a recession this year?
I'm pretty confident. I do give a probability. It's a judgmental probability, but nevertheless, I try to quantify just how confident I am. And right now, we're saying a 15% probability that the economy will enter a recession in the next 12 months. And you should think of 15% as sort of an average recession probability, because in the post-war period, there has been a recession about once every 7 years. That's not a tiny number, but it's a number that is well below the consensus estimate. If there are surveys on this, and they currently still say that most forecasters have something in the high 30s or 40% range for recession probability.
What are the wild cards, either positive or negative, that sort of keep you up at night when you think about whether or not your forecast will match up with reality?
Well, the wild cards tend to be, and the shocks tend to be negative. I mean, in some ways, the absence of shocks is often the positive scenario. If there are no shocks, then I think economies tend towards things getting better, people engaging in more transactions, people getting hired, businesses starting when you're in a sort of placid environment. So almost by definition, I think shocks are negative. Now, what am I worried about? Geopolitics would certainly be high up on the list, where we live in a much more unstable world with military conflict, with the war in Ukraine, with the war in the Middle East, with more tensions between the US and China, et cetera, et cetera. So far, the economic impact, especially on the US, has been relatively limited. But you could certainly imagine that widening of the war in the Middle East would become more of an economic issue and much bigger commodity shock, much bigger transport price shock. Again, so far, what we've seen falls well short of the sort of shock that would create a recession. But that's high up on my list. And then I'd also say there are, of course, always unknown unknowns. It's hard to sort of give a long answer about that, but only to say that the shock that occurred 4 years ago was kind of the most extreme version of an unknown that we have seen in many decades, if not ever.